Thanks very much, Kitty. Thank you for the invitation. It's an amazing event. We're here to have a conversation about government and technology and digital. To have that conversation, I need to tell you some stuff for it to make any sense. So I'm going to ask for your patience, and I'm going to do this really quickly and run through some exposition, really, to tell you what we've been up to in the UK, and then we can talk about maybe how that could work here. So I'll get straight to it, but often with these events, and particularly some of the wackier edges of technology, people have high expectations of what you're going to see today. So I just want to set your expectations. There are no drones in this presentation. Oh, dear me. Can we go back? We don't have any drones. Okay. I think because we were at the start, we'll wait till we're ready. Okay. There you go. There is no biohacking either, and nor are there any cryptocurrencies. What we're here to do is far more exciting than all of those things put together. We're here to talk about public services. And so hold on to your hats, and this is what we're going to do. Very quickly, we're going to do three things. Firstly, tell you a little bit about us in the UK, show why that's relevant to you, and indeed actually to many countries around the world, and then share 5 lessons from our experience that I think are probably relevant here as well. They certainly are relevant listening to some of the conversations we've had. So, let's begin. I'm from the Government Digital Service. We care about users. Our mandate is very simple. In the start of the last parliamentary cycle in 2010-11, a report was written which said revolution, not evolution. And it led to the formation of the Government Digital Service. And we sit at the centre of government.
Of the Government Digital Service, which is committed to ensuring that as we reform the delivery of public services, they are designed around the needs of the user, rather than has been far too often the case in the past, being designed to suit the convenience of the government.
So that's Francis Moore, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, speaking in Parliament. I just want to pause for a moment and say, isn't that extraordinary that a government minister has to stand up and say, we're doing stuff for users of public services? It shows you how extreme the position has become in all governments, but we have to remind ourselves why on earth we create public services. It's for the people who use them. So that's why we put user needs at the heart of everything that we do, and not government needs. And that is at the start, a revolutionary act in government, because there is little that government likes better than government. Talking about its government, its style, its techniques. And so we've really focused on user needs. One of those needs, when we found out when we launched GovUK, what we did was we closed thousands of websites. And when we did that, we found something quite interesting, is that all our different websites and services were giving slightly different messages to users. And we didn't have a single answer for some actually quite important questions. So back in 2011, if you asked that question, what's the government's policy on Afghanistan, they were all the places where the answers were. And funnily enough, they weren't saying quite the same thing. So we did this, and now all of that information is on one place. There's a canonical source of information, and it's written in a much more consumable style. Also, it looks like the government, not like 12 or 15 different things. So let's talk a little bit about what we do. Why did we go to do those things? Why did we do the Afghanistan pages? Because we just get on with stuff. Our strategy is unapologetically delivery. We have the delivery culture at the heart of central government. This is one of the first things that we did. We created a platform for government services in the UK called gov.uk, funnily enough. And what that means is quite interesting, because we recognise the single user need that people have and businesses have of government, and that is, at the point of interaction with government, you need to recognise you're dealing with the government. What we had previously done with thousands of websites was beyond the limits of human ingenuity, because not one of them, not a single one, looked or felt the same. You had to learn how to deal with every bit of government differently. And that's crazy, because people want to deal with government in the same way. And doing it this way led to international recognition about how we put user needs and user design at the heart of our thinking. And we won the Design of the Year award in 2013. That was a huge achievement, not least because we beat the Olympics into second place, which is, great. What other stuff do? We start giving people in government some technology they can use. The bar isn't raised very high when the aspiration is to be as good as the stuff you have at home. Crucially, we put measurement and analytics at the heart of everything that we do. For those of you who can see this slide, if you go to this URL, gov.uk/performance/tax-disc, what you will see is live numbers of people buying a car tax disc. The live data is everywhere. We publish this. It's on the internet. Because we're users of public services, we have a right to see what services we're providing and how well we're doing. And one of the final programs is to transform 25 of the most important government services. In the UK, and this is a lesson for all governments, in the UK, in central government, that excludes health and a few education, we have 660 services. And yet, the top 50 account for 97% by volume. There's stuff that all government does, tax, benefits, health, driving, stuff like that. So you go at the top 25 and we're getting a really big return on that. And we're transforming, in doing that, these institutions. This is what government looks like. Old buildings, not really fit for digital purposes. And now we're creating digital services, one after the other, and increasingly they look the same and they interoperate. And they're giving users a single view of how government can work. So whilst government and people watching government digitally talk about policy, endlessly talking about policy, we could talk about this stuff, just fixing this stuff, because that's where government happens. Most people's interactions with government is through this stuff. So service delivery and putting user needs at the heart of service delivery is the basis of our mandate. And that has great returns. One of the reasons we can do this is, like all governments, we're cash strapped. And we're part of a group, the Efficiency and Reform Group, and our wider savings came to £14.3 billion last year. That's 1% of GDP, or maybe a house in Aspen. So that's enough of us. Why is this all relevant to you? I want to talk a bit about an idea here called government as a platform, which we're going to discuss later. But what we're doing is taking an idea that Tim first talked about some time ago and delivering it. And we start with a very simple thought, that is that why shouldn't government be good at this stuff? We need to be. In the UK, our version of technology thinking, our version of what we're doing has long historical past. This is a guy called James Brindley, and he famously linked together canals before the Industrial Revolution, and that canal system accelerated the Industrial Revolution. And he realized, he was a great engineer, but what he really realized was you had to network together what already works. I'm delighted to see someone in the audience who recognized this phrase, because what he was really doing is joining small pieces loosely. It's one of the key messages of the internet age, standard protocols, join them together loosely. Here's another guy with great whiskers. This is William Joseph Bazalgette. And for those of you who know London, Bazalgette was tasked, as a public servant, was tasked with fixing the cholera epidemic of 1860. And he built the sewage system. It's an amazing Victorian bit of infrastructure, or you might call it a series of tubes. And he built huge capacity, massive capacity. And not only did he build massive capacity, he made it beautiful. This is one of the pumping systems at the end of it. People used to go for a day out, say, let's go to the sewers. The Prince Regent had his lunch there, famously, because you can't appreciate infrastructure, because who wants to go down a sewer, but you want to have something to appreciate. Complete folly. But what Bazalgette realised that Brindley didn't, as well as having utility, that public infrastructure needs to be beautiful. And he made it so. And it's powered London to this day. So there's two models there. And there's something with Brindley and Bazalgette both had, is that they were government employees close to central government who really knew about technology, innovation and engineering. You have a similar tradition. It occurs to us, watching from afar, that you can be quite handy at this stuff as well, but only when there's a crisis. The interstate route, arguably a sort of post-war crisis, the ARPANET, crisis of the Cold War, one could argue. There's certainly a crisis now. You've just had one. You're not alone. Don't worry, we have them as well. One of the reasons we're here is that we've got 15 years of IT failures. There's a crisis of delivery going on in public services, and the answer has to be digital. And if the answer is digital, we've got to make it so, not talk about it. So, we've done a load of stuff. This is quick exposition. So here's 5 things from our experience that we think could be transferred to most governments, particularly this one. Firstly, forget about the old structures of government. This goes down a treat in government, this one. The critical thing about government is that policy-led hierarchies make delivery impossible. When government is increasingly staffed with people who write documents back and forth to each other, not with people who really understand how stuff gets made, and actually having a layer between those people and politicians is a real problem. Now, political elites know this. You want to get elected, you've got to be good at digital. Obama showed you that here. But policy elites haven't. Because making government digital is no longer a policy option. It's a delivery crisis. The future of our government digital service, and I suspect yours, is not going to come from policy documents written back and forth from these centres of government. It's going to come from the places where government exists. And as much as we like to think of it, the delivery of government does not exist in our capital cities. It exists wherever people use it, in towns and cities all over the country. Because civic infrastructure gets made on the ground. There was recently a conference in New York talking about democracy. Everyone's a big idea, democracy. Everyone thinks, well, is a certain policy issue a failure of democracy? We contend that it's not the big policy failures, but it's the constant drip, drip, drip of inadequate services. Every time you have to fill out a form, duplicate form, go to a call centre, turn up for the 5th time for an office, every bit of social friction that causes to you, your family, your economic well-being, that's a failure of government. We are all touched by the failures of government technology. This is an example. In the UK, we have a service called lasting powers of attorney. It's very important, something only the state can do. And it's about transferring assets when someone's died or there's intestate. And it was a terrible service, 5 forms all the same, solicitors need to sign them back and forth. And you had to do it at a time of life when you've got other stuff to be getting on with. So we made a digital service. And this is what happened. Our colleagues in Birmingham called us up and said, you've got to come back and add something. And we said, well, what is it? It's working now. I said, oh, you've got to have a positive feedback button, because we've never had any. No one's ever told them this has been good. But when we've made them digital and we put user needs at the heart of it, people are now saying this is really good. That's where you strengthen democracy. 2, forget the old binaries. We are full of old binaries in government, and critically, it's no longer about public or private. We have found that this idea that one is somehow better than the other doesn't really work. What really works is an organisation, whatever its genesis, is an organisation focused on its users. If you're focused on your users, you've got a very good chance of delivering user services. If you've not, you won't. It's as simple as that. These brands have found that in the UK. I suspect many government organisations and agencies are going to go down the same route. This is critical. No more big IT. What does big IT mean? Well, you just had a lesson on that. We've had many lessons on big IT. The idea that a problem equates to a big system, and a big system means a big procurement, that no longer holds true. The success rate is in the 1 or 2% range out of 100. It's just not working anymore. I don't know how you guys over here, we can't spend any more money on IT. Our supply base used to be here. 84% of government spending on technology was going to these places on a map. We're not the biggest country, we can do a bit better than that. It now looks like this, opening up that supply chain to SMEs. When I heard a senator here, Senator, I think, John McCain, talk about Obamacare, he famously said, why don't you get these guys from Silicon Valley and fly them over? Like, as if they're going to sort of walk in and just repair stuff with a screwdriver. It's like, well, why don't you open up a supply chain so they bid for it in the first place? Critically, we change these procurement laws as much as we can and put them in a design manual so that how you bid and how you work with government and the standards that you need is open to everyone. It no longer has to be this procurement Esperanto that we have to speak. 4th lesson, this is a global idea. You're looking at some guy you've never heard from before from the UK, it's all good, but this is happening in countries all over the world. I haven't got time to show you many, but if you want to look at one, have a look at Estonia. This is a country that when the Russians left in 91-2, they took everything, like literally everything, and they had no money or no infrastructure. So they started again, and they engineered a lot of their digital services from the ground up. But they did it in an open standards, interoperable way, and today they lead the world in digital services. With Jen and the work that colleagues are doing in the US, there's a start here, and you started with 18F. But many other countries around the world are leading and going much, much more quickly than some of the older countries. Because sharing what we do makes it stronger, it makes government stronger. Here's a small example. We launched gov.uk, it's open source, open standards, you can go take it. People did, they didn't ask us, this was great. Honolulu took it, even took some of the content, I'm not quite sure what happened there. But today, this is New Zealand on the right, taking our content, taking our code and using it. And when they make that code better, we get it back and we become stronger. So governments can see that technology has a sharing value and that we can start to share it and we all get better with it. And finally, however much we share it, we have to recognize there's not a single size fits all. That's been one of the big problems in digital government for the last 20 years. You can buy some tick box, one size fits all. Governments don't work that way. It must have a local flavour. Our flavour looks like this. Brindley and Bazalgette and people before them meant that we have a long tradition of delivering hardware as a public service. In the public realm, we have been pretty good at this stuff. We're now delivering software as a public service. When you add those two things together, you form a stack. Hardware and software, open source, interoperable, called a GovStack. That's what we do. People can share it and people can use it. The reason we do this is fundamental, because we believe if you build beautiful digital public services, that is the key to a strong, equitable relationship between citizens and the state. And my word, that relationship needs strengthening right now. So, we're going to start talking in a minute. I hope that that's made some sense and given you some context. So I'm going to start the debate here, if that's okay, with Tim. I'm going to talk about governance as a platform. It's a fantastic idea. It has inspired the work that we've done in the UK. But if you apply that idea to government without a public service ethos, then it's just become another valley buzzword. Because one of the other things we've learned is public servants can't pivot. We don't have time to change our mind all the time. We've got to really transform the big bits of government. So what I'd sort of put back to some of the people at this conference is, how do we take the best of Silicon Valley? How do we take the best of Lean? How do we take the best of this culture and apply it back to the public realm? That should start a good debate.
All right, good.
Thanks very much.
So thanks a lot, Mike. Just to be clear, I'm the moderator here. I'm a technology publisher and conference organizer. Jen Pahlka here is the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Code for America, which does things a lot like what Mike does, except working with cities here in the US, although they now have started to do some activities around the world as well. Jen recently took a year off as executive director of Code for America and went to the White House, where was the deputy chief technology officer of the United States, working on government innovation, working to bring a lot of these ideas to bear here. Now, you know, obviously, the failure of healthcare.gov was all over the news. We also know that over a period of 4 or 5 months, there was a healthcare rescue effort. It really happened by putting a lot of these principles into practice. So I'd like to have Jen, from her fount of experience at both the local level and the federal level, perhaps start to address some of these same key ideas. I think both of you start from this same central big idea. You know, here in Aspen we say, what's the big idea? And I think the big idea here is public services should be for people, not for government agencies. And maybe you could tell us some story, just a few war stories from your experience of where it just will make that very vivid to people.
Sure. I mean, the way I think I would phrase the big idea, as I would translate it into sort of this moment in time where X months out from the healthcare.gov failure, is that we need to realize that if we can't implement our policies, we can't govern. And if we don't learn that lesson, we are headed for another one of these. So, you know, I think what might be useful is I tell a little bit of the story of how I kind of got in there. I was running this organization called Code for America. An amazing public servant and brilliant, good-hearted person named Todd Park, who is the Chief Technology Officer of the US, decided that the model that we use, where we get people from, you know, generally from the tech industry to come into government for short periods of time, is something that we should replicate in federal government. So he wanted me to come help with his Presidential Innovation Fellows program. But he happened to call me to ask me to do that when I was visiting Mike. Tim and I were both visiting Mike, truth be told. And I got to see the government digital service in London in action. And for a government tech geek like me, it was like Disneyland, or you just sort of died and gone to heaven. I think he's not even quite, he's a little bit underselling the quality and just the beauty and ease of use of these public services. I mean, you can see the screenshots, but I don't think we have very many citizens of the UK here, so maybe it's not going to be that relevant. But like, you know, imagine, we always said, like, imagine if your relationship with government, no, what was the line we used? If you loved government the way you loved your iPhone, like if you could pay your tax or, you know, do something as complicated and burdensome as the power of attorney was as easy as, you know, registering for Uber and getting a car. I mean, it's like, it really does change how you feel about this institution. So I was just so excited about what they were doing that when Todd called and said, please, you know, I'd like you to come join our team, I said, I would love to help you with the fellows program, but I already run a fellows program. I think what we really need to do is to rethink the strategy and try to figure out how to crack the nut that these guys have cracked. In general, so Mike's team put out a strategy that went like this, and tell me if I'm getting it right. Let's fix publishing, by which he means the several thousand websites. I think you guys have said you've taken 1,200 or 1,400 websites and put them on gov.uk. So in the federal government, we think 30 to 40,000 federal government websites. Each of them have thousands of pages of content.
Some of them have no users.
Yes, some of them have no users whatsoever. I don't think probably anybody in this room has probably ever interacted with more than 3 or 4 pages of that content. Every one of those websites has a whole big IT spend behind it and maintenance on it and sort of no way of sunsetting it. But to get back, he's fixed publishing, which we haven't done yet, then fixed transactions, which is that make this thing as easy as Uber, and then go wholesale. Now, what we've done in the US is a little bit reverse. Brilliant strategy of open data that Todd Park really, I think, inspired by a lot of what Tim was saying, let's get the data from government out there and let people build their own services on it, which is a wonderful idea. But we didn't follow that if government as a platform is the metaphor, and the iPhone is sort of the best example of that, well, your iPhone didn't ship with no apps on it. It had remember when you first got an iPhone or an Android phone, probably for many of you it was an iPhone? It had like, what, 7 or 8, 10 really good apps that showed how good it was supposed to be. That's what we need to do. We need to
and then you open up the platform, and then you get the private sector adding to it.
So we really have an enormous amount to learn, I think, from what has gone on in the UK. A number that you should be aware of is $172 billion is what we think is being spent on government IT in this country. That's state, local, federal together, I believe. But it only talks about the money that goes to contractors. It doesn't even talk about the money the actual government is spending on employees for this stuff. And if that meant we were getting great services that made people feel fantastic about their relationship to government, that would be one thing. But we're not getting that. And we are in, as Mike says, an enormous crisis where if this happens again, so let's say we spend all of our political will again, and gosh, I hope we do, getting immigration reform passed. Well, there's a whole bunch of systems that have to scale if we do that. E-Verify will go from being optional to mandatory. There's all the back-end adjudication and management systems of processing people through that are very, very complex things that will have to get way better, very quickly. And it could be a lot like healthcare.gov. And I think that if we don't nail that implementation, we're not going to get another chance. It is so hard to get the important policies passed, but we're dropping the ball on implementation, and nobody realizes how critical this is.
So, Mike, from your point of view, at least looking as an outsider, one of the reasons for your success is you have top-level sponsorship. You report directly to a cabinet minister.
Yeah.
So that gave you, a fair amount of air cover. You also had something that I don't think we have in the U.S., which is a native delivery capability. Mm-hmm. That is when, even if we had a brilliant technologist who was in your position reporting to, the very top of government, if they didn't have that delivery capability, they couldn't, for example, shut down a bad service and replace it with a good one. I'm remembering a conversation that we had with a senior U.S. official, and he said, "How do you get buy-in?" And you said, "Well, we don't. When we see a government service that doesn't work, we build an alternative, and when we have happy users, we go to the people running the lousy one and we say, we're shutting you down. And that process is
I think he said he just shuts it down, he doesn't tell them.
But the question, I guess what I'd love to sort of unpack for you, could you kind of, I think it's pretty clear that you've pulled off something that we haven't yet pulled off in the U.S. Despite the healthcare.gov rescue, which brought in some very talented people from Silicon Valley to sort of turn around a very badly bungled situation, we haven't done the kind of systematic reform yet, despite Jen's efforts, that you did. So maybe you could talk through some of the critical enabling conditions that made that possible. I just listed 2 of them, but maybe you could talk about it.
Yeah. So on the people side, when I came to government and I negotiated, I was offered the role and I negotiated, the thing people do when they go to government is say, well, I want a big budget. And one of the bigger government departments, the IT, the CTO told me, said, I've got £1.25 billion budget, give or take a few hundred million. Well, okay. So I said, I don't want any of that. I'll take the value of the 2 web contracts that we have for 2 websites, which was sort of £50 million, so that'll do. And I want a building, and I want to be able to hire whoever I like. And we did.
The hiring authority, I think, is a critical one, because you were able to go and recruit some of the top tech talent. You were described, I think, as the hottest tech startup in London.
Yeah, and we've grown now to sort of nearly 600 people, and we've grown organically. Because those people really, it's a generational play. They are driven by 2 things. They want to do great stuff that matters. That's always been the case in younger, talented people, but crucially, they want to work with a peer group of people like them. And basically, we put the sign on the door saying, we're hiring, come and work with stellar people. And when you get here, we'll enable you to work on stuff that truly matters and scales right across the country. So very quickly, they say, look, I did this thing, and everyone in the country benefits. So that brought them in. The interesting thing then, we had to then talk about what are we going to work on, because I think one of the reasons why people in government don't use the powers that they have, and I must say our powers, I've used formal powers 3 times, I have parliamentary powers, I've used them 3 times formally, you don't really need to, but most people in government don't use them for a variety of reasons, mostly about them not wanting to rock the boat. But what we said was, look, let's just look at it from the eyes of a user and go, what matters the most? And we had this great exercise. We formed an algorithm. You've heard a lot about algorithms here. It's called a Nidotron. And we recognized all the things that government did and then basically put them in front of people in a very sort of binary mode, said, well, what's important to you? Is it like a driving license or a fishing license? What's more important? Because most people went, driving license, right? Because that's more important. So, okay. But then you start getting to passport or driving license. And we just sort of gave people, tens of thousands of people at times. And we end up with a hierarchy, and we chopped it off about 900. We went, right, we're going to do the top 900, because everything else after that is marginal. And we went after that stuff. And then in terms
that really brings up a really important point, I think, which is if you're in a Silicon Valley startup and you're focused on users, you're really focused on the features that matter to your users. And if you're typically in government, you have a whole bunch of mandates coming down for various kinds of political reasons. And maybe out of your 900 features you were just talking about, half of them wouldn't have made the cut because there were a bunch of features that didn't matter to users that were more important to some government department or other, and it was through this internal politicking that they got specified as the top things to work on. Yeah. So it's a very, very different process, and it's pretty clear that this is the way it should work. If we're building services for citizens, we need a process that lets us figure out what citizens really need, and you work on those things first.
In doing that, I mean, that's a neat idea the way we did it, but there's, the rough bit of that was that we took about 40% of government content and just retired it. We'd written content on stuff like, if you go outside and it's cold, put a jumper on. That was one. If you leave your small child at the top of stairs, that could be a problem. We'd written a guide to waves coming in and out. I mean, we're an island, we have lots of waves. So we looked at who's reading this stuff, and we had, like you say, we had people like no one had ever read stuff. So we just retired it. We put it in the National Archive. You can still get it. And what we'd had like 15 years of indiscriminate policy level publishing. I think it's important, so I'll publish it. There's never any feedback. There's everyone saying, well, who's looked at that? Is it any good? Does it work? What's the outcome of that piece of content or transaction? And the moment you have that data platform, the moment you can start showing your numbers, it's like it stops being subjective. It's like, look, you're spending money on this stuff, no one's looking at it, let's stop doing that. And most people are reasonable, they just go, okay.
But that really does bring in an important point. You actually have to be measuring things. And I would say that the culture that you built with the Government Digital Service of measuring how many people are using the services is very, again, akin to what a Silicon Valley company would do, saying we're building this, we're seeing what features people are using, we're testing things. If we do it this way, do more people use it? If we do it that way, do more people use it? Versus, for example, healthcare.gov, maybe you can talk more to this, Jen. When the rescue team came in, they found there was no measurement at all. He said the only way people could figure out if the site was up or down was trying it, versus, anyway, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Sorry, I did just give it away.
Fine. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a perennial problem in government. The process by which you build a big service like that is a compliance-driven process. So there's about 7 million things that you have to check boxes that you have to check. But is the service up? Does it work? Are users getting through? Are not those boxes? Which is really wrong. So yeah, I mean, when a guy named Mikey Dickerson, well, there were a number of folks, but Mikey's become a good friend, Mike and Mikey, was brought in from Google. I mean, I will actually just take a moment to talk about the people who saved healthcare.gov. Mikey got a call one night about, I think, 7 o'clock and got on a plane the next morning to DC just because somebody told him, the Affordable Care Act is going to fail if this site doesn't go up. And he said, I can't let that happen. This is not acceptable. It's not acceptable that we don't give health care to people in our country. He showed up the next morning, and I think by that afternoon, he was at the contractor's office and been asked to sort of figure out how to help. He had no authority. He wasn't anybody. I mean, I think that in the next couple of days, they'd sort of somehow got him hired onto one of these contractors. So he was just another person in the room, but he started running these stand-up meetings, and he started asking people to figure out, well, if that's not happened, why? It's not that he was so brilliant technically. He just knew what you do to make a service work and to sort of find their way through the sort of chain of command to get stuff done. But he worked. He looked at his work logs, and he worked 20 hours a day for 90 days straight. And he and a bunch of other people did that to make the site work. And I think that we all owe those guys an enormous debt of service. I'm so glad that you guys have been able to do this. I'm sure you've worked long hours, but do it not in a crisis mode. We owe it to Mikey Dickerson and his team that saved the site to really fix it so we don't have to do that again. But back to your point, as Mikey says, there's sort of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs when it comes to a digital service. And if you don't have monitoring, if you don't know if your site is up, how many users are on it, who's going through, where it's failing, you can't actually do anything. And that's the situation that he walked into. Was there were over 700 contractors working on this site, and it wasn't working, and nobody knew what to do. Yeah. And he had to fight for 2 weeks to even get that monitoring, I think it was a little bit less than 2 weeks, to get that monitoring installed. But it's not part of how we approach projects, and it's going to have to change.
I think there's a fundamental issue that governments need to face, and it's one that we all face as individuals in our lives as we grow up, and it's one of self-image and the ego. And governments all over the world think of themselves as big, physically, from a point of influence, and you say, well, we're big government. And when you come to digital government, it's really not very big. This is a very big conceit of government. So this big IT thinking, it's like, let's throw 1,000 people at it. It's the last thing you should do. Like, let's try and have 12 people who really know what they're doing. They can make a good healthcare service, or certainly a minimum viable service. And so government needs to get over itself and go, most of the stuff that we do in the UK, take off the really big stuff like tax. Most of the stuff is on digitally in terms of transactions about the size of an average dating site. And dating sites are completely commoditized. You could have one up tomorrow if you like. And that's a very, very hard lesson for people in government to learn, that actually digitally and technically we're not that important. But it doesn't need to be big, but the people who use it do scale exponentially if you get it right. We recently had a benefit service for carers allowance. Carers in the UK get a benefit. It's very complicated, depending if you're looking after somebody. And the actual process of applying is unbelievably difficult. And that leads to a lot of social friction. So we launched the site and we got the data out. And we had a spike in users between roughly 3 and 6 in the morning. That's very odd, people transacting with them at that time. And our user research told us it's the only time they get respite. It's the only time they're not looking after another human being. These services are really important. There is over 100,000 people in our country going to use that service this year. It is vital that you know about them. You can't just push it out there and say, go on, deal with that. You've got to have some degree of empathy and service design. And governments are going to have to do 2 things. Recognize they're not big when it comes to digital, and recognize they have to put a bit of empathetic user design in place of these sort of monopolistic services that have been pushing out. And that is a very tough lesson for governments to learn, because governments generally are not set up to accept those 2 facts.
Can I add 2 things to
Sure.
that? To the point about government not being as big as it thinks, Stephen Levy broke this story recently, so it's not a secret anymore, but Mikey Dickerson and his team sort of duct taped the current site together to get to 8 million people registering for healthcare, which is an amazing feat, miraculous. In parallel, another team led by a woman named Jeannie Kim basically rewrote healthcare.gov. So think about the 3 years in which they had, I think, 2 primes and 60 subcontractors writing the healthcare.gov that you saw on October 1st. Jeannie and her 12 colleagues basically rewrote the whole thing with modern technology in 3.5 months. So that now the new thing is sort of page by page, part by part, sort of moving into the old. But if we had just had those guys write it from the start, it works great. And I don't think, and if you, I had a great conversation with this woman who's the deputy secretary of an agency I won't name, right after healthcare.gov had failed, and I was just meeting with her to talk about our agenda. And she said, well, I know what went wrong. Here at our agency, we know how to get money through. At Health and Human Services, they couldn't get the money through fast enough, so they didn't spend enough money. And I said, no, you don't understand. They spent way too much money. And the great thing is this woman who doesn't really understand technology, within 5 minutes, she completely agreed with me. So you've got to, they really actually do get it, if you can explain it. The second thing I'll say, just relevant to the empathy issues, we see this at Code for America all the time. And Ezra Klein made this point very well, and then Tim echoed it, is that the experience that middle-class people had trying to navigate that site is just what poor people deal with every single day.
Correct.
If they have to get food stamps, or if their kids are in custody, or or if they're dealing with the criminal justice system. It's maddening. It would drive any of you absolutely nuts if you had to deal with these services. We just don't talk about it because it never hits the middle class. Now we have a little bit more experience with it. But if you don't understand that, and we heard the same stories, people were getting up at 3 in the morning to try to get one step further through the site so that they could hope to get their health insurance by the deadline. We shouldn't be doing that to people.
Could you talk just very briefly before we go to audience questions about, as an example, the work that Code for America did in San Francisco with food stamps, because that kind of illustrates a lot of those kinds of issues.
Sure. Actually, I think we have, if you want to bring up the slides, I think I put at the end an example of this. The way our fellowship program works, just pull forward to that. The way our fellowship program works, we get people from the tech world, so they're often from Google or Apple, to come work with cities for a year. Last year, we were asked by the City and County of San Francisco to help them figure out what's going on with the food stamps program. So what happens is if you enroll, so it's called CalFresh, it's the state's nutrition assistance program, we're just going to call it food stamps. If you enroll in this program, as our fellows did, so to figure, and this is a key thing, we have to have people who manage these services actually use the services to know what's going on. So one of our fellows, Jake Solomon, enrolled in the program. And what happened is exactly what happens to everyone else, which is you get enrolled, and then 2 months later, you're dropped off of the rolls. So they have this unbelievable churn problem. You know, you come in, then you're dropped off. And then you come in again, and then you're dropped off. Well, that costs a lot of money. So we spend far more money administering the program than we need to. It's not the dollars that you're paying for someone to go, as we heard on Marketplace the other night, to Walmart to get their food. It's the dollars you spend administering that dollar, getting to that person. So it's now not a mystery why they get dropped off. You probably can't read this, but try enrolling in food stamps sometime. I don't know how you're going to do it, but try. You will get these letters in the mail. They are completely incomprehensible. Your food stamps benefit in this quarter did not change as a result of the pages and pages of language that I have read. I don't understand what they're saying. I don't know what it is I'm supposed to do. Our fellows whose job it was to explore this couldn't stay in compliance with the program, and so they were dropped off. And they found, and when they did their user research, they would meet these people who would say, midnight, the day that my thing, or whenever it is, I go to get my groceries. I am there at the front of the line with my kids. I have a lot of food bagged up because, the cupboards are bare. I swipe my card. There's a long line of people behind me, and my card doesn't work. So it's not just that I'm not eating tonight, my kids aren't eating tonight, but it's humiliating. Everyone behind me is going, what's up with that welfare mom? So the fellows finally said, look, we've got to figure out a way to do this. It turns out to be incredibly hard to change the language in these letters, which still boggles my mind. But they figured out that they could collect the cell phone numbers of the people in the program, and they started texting them. If they were out of compliance, they get a text message now that says, your CalFresh benefits may end this month. Questions, call us. And 40% fewer people started falling off the rolls because they could call in and say, what do I have to do not to have my EBT card not work?
So that's really the power of user-centered design in government services. With that, let's open this up to questions from the audience, if anyone has any. Okay.
Thanks. Very nice presentation on both sides of the pond. My name is Barbara Ryan, and I'm director of the Group on Earth Observations in Geneva, Switzerland. So you talked about services, and that's real good. So I didn't hear much about data itself in terms of opening it up. And so from my experience on this side, there are more open policies for the broad release of predominantly geospatial data. And if you do, in fact, want to kind of stimulate your small and medium-sized enterprises, do you think on the UK side, are policies changing for Ordnance Survey data or UK Met Service data so that other entities can come in and start building value-added products and services off that government data? And then I guess there might be an analog on here in the United States, maybe just with kind of breaking down some of the silos between those individual organizations that collect that information. I think there are generally policies for broad open data, but maybe the government agencies need to work a little bit more closely together on that front. And I'll stop. Thanks.
Up to you, Mike.
We're opening data. Can't talk specifically about those agencies, but watch this space. We've led away on opening up a lot of data, open government partnership, as you know. But the critical thing is that opening up data is the first step. But opening up, you don't just open it up and expect great things to happen. So if you take some of our agencies, Companies House in the UK is the agency that you have to register with to open a business. And it recently opened the fire hose of its data to organizations. And one of them created a service called duedeal.org, which now most people prefer to go to because it's a consultancy service that adds added value on top. But it offers better services, and there's a model there. But we're at the early days of this. There's a couple of problems. Firstly, our data in government, and I speak for most governments here, we don't really have a good grip on our data. It's not consistent. It's certainly not open. And many times the data lives in macros and in PDFs and spreadsheets. It's hard to liberate. And even when you do, contractually, it often is in the hands of people who are giving services to. We recently about a year ago, we wanted to add 7 words and a tick box to our driving services for organ donation. So we know from behavioral intelligence that says that's one of the places where people will take an organ donation card. So we turned to our providers and said, we want to do that. I said, oh, well, it'll be 50 grand to scope that out, and it'll be another 100 days to look at it, and then you have to wait for change control, and that'll be another 3 months. And it's very difficult, this stuff, you know. So like, really? So we did it in like 15 minutes and opened it up. So opening up that data is great, but in and of itself, that isn't the stimulus for creating new services, because what you have to have is some degree of bidirectional capacity so people can send you stuff back to clean it up. And there are very few governments that are there yet. We are getting there, we're slowly getting there, and we're cleaning house with our data. I'm very proud of what we've done. But if you look at Estonia, where they have a very rigid register model, where the actual data register, they keep a very sharp eye on it and then spin it out for services, I think most countries are going to get there in the next 10 years.
Mike, I just wonder if you could reflect. It's boggling to me that we had how many contractors working on health.gov, and I don't even understand how we got ourselves into the mess that we got, and nobody was looking. And I remember when we chatted, you didn't even want to talk about that because it was just such a mess. So that question number one is, how can we avoid this in the future? And my observation from sessions here and in the past is IDEO is here every night, and this whole notion of human-centered design thinking. And does anybody actually talk to citizens besides you about what they need online? I mean, it seems so obvious, but we're just the way you described that people respond to a text, but can't even read a letter because we're so bureaucratic. I mean, how do we get out of this mess?
It's not because we're bureaucratic. It's it's the way the government thinks about itself. Genuinely, I think we have a crisis of confidence. There's a huge middle-class problem in all governments. People who run governments generally don't use the services that governments provide. That's a massive problem. So in the budget 2 years ago, in our annual budget, the Chancellor said that for any digital services to go live, the minister had to use it. Now, I remember at the time, some very senior colleagues in civil service said, "You can't possibly. What on earth do you think you're doing? Asking these people whose very career depends on these services to actually use them." It's like, how can we be so separate that the very people who have been elected to take responsibility for the services are sort of barred from using them? And
it's
this
a big contrast to, say, Google, where Sergey Brin used to be the one who was saying, testing out were the results any good,
And
very different world.
These problems aren't technological nor bureaucratic. One needs a bureaucracy. I work in one. Governments need that. The problems are really ones of culture and ones of 15 to 20 years of monopolist culture and a really disregard for users of public services. I'm being really frank that most people towards the upper echelons of government not even don't use the services, they never come into contact with people who do. So healthcare.gov comes as a really nasty shock. But as I say, we've just had them as well. We're not alone. And governments have got to find a way of reconnecting. The political level wants to reconnect. Politicians reconnect all the time. They have to use digital tools to do that. But until the sort of mid and upper levels of governments do that, that's what needs to change. And that's a cultural change.
Oh, it's not just digital services. I heard a kind of a heart-rending story from one of the Code for America fellows who was working on that San Francisco food stamp project, who was in a different social services office, and he found out that there are separate bathrooms for the staff and for the clients. That tells you everything you need to know about that kind of problem.
Yeah.
Can I add a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's also that, I don't think it's true that people weren't watching on healthcare.gov. They were absolutely watching. They were asking the wrong questions. But also, I think there's a culture in government that is it's very hierarchical, and so you're just telling your developer people what to do, and they're not allowed to talk back.
Yeah.
They're not allowed to say, that doesn't work, we have to fix it. And we really have to change the conversation within government from telling people what to do and making them sort of comply with these timeframes and these large schedules to, here's what we think is going to work. Can you try it? Okay, tell me how it's working. It's like we have to actually put policy people and geeks in conversation so they can tell you that thing isn't going to work. But no one is allowed to say that, and no one, in a tech company, the people doing the product are going, this is what the data is telling us the users want. That's not a conversation that's easy to have in government.
These are
profound question. Oh wait, we got quite a few questions here and not much time left. So let's see. Let's go over here.
First, I am going to compliment you on social interestingly, I got on the website and I did pretty well with it.
Don't thank me.
Well, it took a while. But when I want to change my address, it got really complicated. I know this sounds crazy because it should be as easy as going on Yahoo
Yes.
or Charles Schwab or the bank. This is what I don't get. This is an address change. So I called Social Security, and to their credit, 6 hours later, they gave me a time, and believe it or not, they called me back at that time. And God bless them. It was the simplest thing in the world, and the guy was great. But I have 2 other questions, which may be way above your pay grade, although maybe in England you're doing it, I don't know. 2 areas that just beg for electronic something is the post office, and especially with these little post office all over the country. The cost is enormous. I know they're going under. They cost the government so much. We're always reading this. You get so much junk mail on certain days anyway. Is there any plan in this area? That's number one. The second is voting, which of course is, a loaded issue because everyone's worried about that and hacking and God knows what else. But those are 2 areas that are just begging for Charles Schwab. I mean, I just say to myself, it should be easy, and it's not.
In our country, the post office is spun out, so that's a sort of commercial issue for them. We just created a register to vote service, so we just did that digitally with a team of about 20 people. We didn't spend hundreds of millions of pounds on a massive procurement over 5 years. We just created it and linked together all the, in our country, the voting database is held locally by unitary authorities. So we created a service that allows people to register to vote. The actual act of voting is still not digital because we haven't legislated that yet. But once you have a digital register, that's the next logical step. Again, it's not easy, it's doable, but a team of, say, 20 people have been working for 18 months to do that.
Okay, well, I think we can get in maybe one more in the middle.
2 quick questions, one for each of you. First, it'd be interesting to hear about the online to offline and what impact it's had on public servants in general, and this whole concept of measuring performance, what you think will have as an impact from a governance perspective and from political party perspective, how citizens will perceive their role in terms of effectively measuring government moving forward. Is there any dynamic change that you envision happening over the coming 10 years with the sheer fact that people can now see exactly what's going on? And my second question is a little bit related to that. I was just wondering, when I look at the U.S. and the challenges, there almost seems to be a disincentive for efficiency. I mean, just from talking from the several types of contracts that are already coming out of government, and I'm wondering how hard of a fight it's going to be to get to a point where you can really effectively measure and track government performance, and where does it start? So if it's revolution, not evolution, where does it start? Because it sounds transformational if it can get done.
Do you want to start?
I'm an impartial civil servant. I work for a coalition government, so I just don't answer political questions.
I think your question was about where the U.S. is on sort of being able to measure this stuff. Is that what you're?
Yeah, it seems like interests. There are so many vested interests against something like this really effectively taking shape, and I'm just wondering where does the transformation start? I mean, if it's where do you start creating this change where citizens can actively see the performance of government and understand it?
So I think there's a couple questions there. I mean, basically, the answer to where does the transformation start is exactly what Mike said. The strategy is delivery. You stop talking, you start doing something, people start believing, boom, you're halfway, I mean, not halfway there, but you've got, then the door is open and then you get to move. That's what we were doing at Code for America, just sort of showing up and building something, and it's kind of amazing how much that changes people's minds. In terms of the measurement stuff, and entrenched interest, I mean, we haven't started changing the dynamics of the vendor ecosystem enough yet to get pushback. I welcome the day that CGI comes after. Sorry, I shouldn't.
CGI was the prime contractor on healthcare.gov.
Yes, and so I think, can I say this? Yes. So I loved walking around after the healthcare.gov thing, I'd been preaching the gospel of gov.uk and the GDS in the White House, and everyone's going, oh my God, this CGI thing. I'm like, right, that's the contractor that went after Mike and tried to shut down. They called the government digital service an impediment to innovation, which I find absolutely laughable. So yes, if you start to hit people where it hurts, they probably will at some point come after you. I think there is a way, as you guys have done quite gracefully, to just change the incentives for the ecosystem and let them do good work. We make them do bad work right now. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's all resistance, but sure, you'll hit some. It's not, to me, a mystery why we're not getting that yet.
Anyway, I think it's a small, it's a situation where you make small advances, but there is progress, I think, in cities across the country where people are really understanding that it's possible to do this differently. The work that Code for America has been doing has really led the way. The White House is on board. They're starting to try to build some of the same capabilities through both the Presidential Innovation Fellows and some new programs that have gotten started or are still underway. And obviously, governments like the UK and others around the world, Estonia and New Zealand, are starting to get together and really push the ball forward. And I think if you look at the history of technology, you'll see that that's really always how it happens. You have these little trickles, and then somebody makes a breakthrough, and then everybody sort of starts piling on. And that's what we hope to have happen here. Any closing comments? Or I think
I think I have a thing in my office because I got so fed up, and it's a massive poster about the size of that, and it says, show the thing. And you can't come into my office and ask for any money or anything if you can't show the thing. And those three words are the very basis of how we approach services. It's like, you don't procure anything, don't come in with any slide decks, don't come asking for hundreds of millions of pounds. If you can't create a working version, even some HTML pages, of the thing that you want to build in 6 weeks with your own government money, then you're not getting it. And I pretty much can't think of a government digital service, big or small, that wouldn't be made better if you weren't made to show the thing within the first 6 or 8 weeks. That's, if there's one thing I want government officials to do, is insist that we always show the thing.
All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much.